Sinister Harry Potter crossover short story, Harry Potter and the Babylonian Deity. Author's note. This is the second part of Chapter 2. It still takes place in the year 1987. After the wizard and witch disappeared, and Hagrid mounted his bike and roared back into the sky, the street looked like it had before the disturbance. Dumbledore had restored the lights. From the darkness a figure emerged. At quick glance he could be mistaken for a man, for he had many humanoid features. If you happened to look at his face, though, you realized he was not. He had been known by many names across time and many cultures: Amit, Morlech, Cronus, the Boogeyman, etc. Of late, though, he had taken to being called by one of his more obscure names, Bagul. This was more due to the preferences of his child servants, who seemed to prefer that name to all the others. Of course, they had shortened it to Mr. Boogie, comically making him sound less like a deity and more like he should be starring in Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. He didn't mind, as his survival depended on the children seeing him as something more benign than what he actually was, and if a silly name aided in that misconception, then it only helped him. Contrary to what had been written about him by ignorant humans, Bagul wasn't restricted to hunting where his images appeared or at the houses where the families of his child victims were killed. It was easier and more convenient to enter this world through an already established doorway, yes, but there were many portals he could take. If he had been so limited as the humans believed, he would have starved to death eons ago. Early Christians had destroyed many of his images. It wasn't uncommon for the houses to be occupied by people who didn't have children, or to fall into disrepair because nobody wanted to live in a house where a murder had taken place, and many had been demolished over the years. In fact, what had recently brought him to England, and after hunting in America for the last 100 years, was that his last house had been destroyed and had an adult bookstore built on top of it. Such was life, sunrise and sunset. He didn't need a new child just now, which was fortunate, as what also sometimes happens, a family moved into the house, but the child is too young to do what Bagul needs them to do. The tubby child seemed to promise to be a dullard, and Bagul was debating about whether he should even bother with that one, though no doubt it would be easily manipulated. But this child lying on the doorstep, this one had promise. Bagul leaned closer, seeming to inhale the child. No soul was the same. They differed in energy levels, composition, and taste. The fat child had a sluggish, rather bland soul, but this child burned like a star in Bagul's eyes. His soul had a lot of energy, and there was something even more interesting. His soul contained the piece of another. How astounding! In all his years, he had never come across something like this. As a general rule, Bagul didn't intend to prey upon wizard children. It wasn't that they were any less vulnerable, it was more that Bagul favored Muggles over the citizens of the wizard world, even though it had been the Muggles that were responsible for destroying his many temples and the religion that worshipped him. When wizards had ruled the world openly, they had been blindly obedient servants, and in those days he never had to work for his meals. It was a matter of showing up at the temple and clapping his hands, and a child, who was often a Muggle, would simply be handed to him. He had seen that the system was doomed to end eventually. He hadn't been angered by the Muggles, really. It had been the stupidity of the wizards that had caused the system to fall, and which would eventually result in them going into hiding. As humans were prone to do, wizards had gone overboard. Bagul wasn't greedy. He only needed one child sacrificed to him about every 10 years. The wizards, though, made it a habit of sacrificing children more frequently than that. Sometimes Bagul would accept these sacrifices, but more often than not the lives were wasted. When Bagul accepted a sacrifice, the child disappeared. Even when the wizard priests noticed that the children's bodies remained, a sure sign that Bagul hadn't accepted it, they continued to sacrifice more children. He remembered the time that the wizards of Carthage sacrificed more than 500 children in one day. Had Bagul accepted all of them, his netherworld would have been overrunning with brats. Overnight, he had gone from terrifying demonic deity to daddy warbucks that everyone tried to push their unwanted children upon. Of course, the other problem had been that the wizards were not in the habit of sacrificing wizard children. They took muggle children from poor families and raised them to be sacrifices. This ultimately is what led to the demise of the religion that worshipped him, as well as the demise of the wizard rule. Many Muggle mothers wept to see their children murdered, particularly in the horrible fashion in which it was done. The wizard priest would send the child tumbling down the mouth of a statue, and in the stomach the child would burn to death. The Muggles realized that Bagul was not accepting most of the sacrifices. In time, they also caught on that Bagul did nothing in return, as the wizards believed. Many wizards believed Bagul solved their sexual problems, healed their illnesses, made their wives fertile, made them wealthy, and made their crops grow. In truth, he did none of these things. The wizards were fooled because it seemed their lives improved. But the reason often was psychosomatic. If your wife is always getting pregnant and you're always worried about money and feeding all those hungry mouths, sacrificing a child or two could do much to solve your problems. When the wizards had been overthrown and forced into hiding, Bagul's temples had been destroyed, and he had been forced to work a little harder for his meals. He didn't begrudge it, though. Muggles were fascinating. They were more inspired and creative than wizards had been. They were suspicious and yet so gullible. They were obsessed with morality, and yet they were often the biggest hypocrites and capable of horrendous evil. All this inner turmoil made their souls quite flavorful. He worked harder for his meals, but his meals were more satisfying. He reached down and caressed the child's forehead. Harry's face puckered and he whimpered. Bagul pulled his hand back and straightened up. Yes, this one would be worth the wait. He could be patient.